Hi, my name is Eric, and today I'm going to quickly go over how to convert your Excel worksheet data to JSON data, all while using only Excel and VBA code. And of course, you can download the code that I'm showing you how to write using the link in the description. This is on GitHub, and you can see the Excel files right here, so you can go ahead and get started immediately, or you can stick around and watch the tutorial and get a good explanation of how this works. So as you can see, this is the final Excel file that we are going to be creating. In the first sheet, we have just some sample data of some companies and their headquarters location and the industry that they're in, and you can see we have a header for each column here in the first row. On the second sheet, we have a button, and when we click the button, it will immediately fill in the next cell over here with our JSON data that was created based off the data in the first sheet. And you can see it's in the format of an array of JSON objects with the column header for each property as each property's key. So you can see company is the name of the first property, headquarters name of the second property, etc. And it does that for each object in the array. Now I'm also going to show you how to get your JSON data to come out as an array of arrays rather than an array of objects. So if we go over and take a look at our VBA code, we're going to change this one argument to true, and we're going to go back to the first sheet and get rid of our header row, and then we're going to click parse again, and now you can see we have an array of string arrays rather than an array of JSON objects. And as you can see, I have a new Excel file open, and the only thing I've done so far is just paste the sample data I had in that other file into the first sheet. And now that we have this, we're going to create a new sheet, and we're going to want to make some space here because we're going to put our button in cell A1, and then we're going to put our JSON data in cell B1. Now I need to go over to the developer tab up here in the ribbon. If you can't see that, you need to enable that in options. To do that, go to File, Options, and then you're going to go to the Customize ribbon menu and make sure that Developer is checked, and then choose OK, and you should see the Developer tab here in the ribbon. Choose Insert, and then under Form Controls, choose Button. And if you hold down Alt, you can make sure that the button that you're drawing here on the worksheet automatically snaps to the cell that you're over. And it's going to ask you what macro to assign. We're going to hit cancel here because we're going to be writing our macro in a minute. We don't have a macro ready to assign the button. We're going to change the label here to just say parse. And now we want to make sure that we save our Excel file. And we're going to choose the location that we want to save it as. And you want to make sure that you save it as an Excel macro enabled workbook instead of just a regular Excel workbook. So now that it's saved, we are going to go ahead and jump into the code. Now you could write your code using the built-in Visual Basic Editor here in Excel, but I'm going to be using Microsoft Visual Studio Code instead, simply because it does a much better job with syntax highlighting and auto-completion. However, once we're done writing the code in Visual Studio Code, we're just going to copy it and paste it into Excel's VBA editor, so it really doesn't matter what you use. This is just easier, and you can get Visual Studio Code from Microsoft for free. So we are going to just save this new file that I have open, And you want to make sure that you choose all files as the file type, and we're going to call it Excel to JSON.VB. So we're going to write two functions and a sub. The sub is going to be what's run when you click the button. So we're going to call our sub parse data. It's going to make sure that we have the correct cell that we want to assign our JSON data to. So we're going to select the worksheet that we're in, worksheet 2 dot range, and we want to select the cell that we want to put our JSON data in. In this case, it's B1, and we want to set the value to the return value of our toJSON function that we're about to write. And then we're going to pass it the return value from the other function that we're going to write called getValuesRange. And to this function, we're going to pass what sheet we want to get our range of values from. In this case, it's sheet 1, since that's where our data is. And we're going to pass it a false Boolean for our second parameter. And I will explain that in a minute. Now we need to write our getValuesRange function, and basically what this function does is it's going to look at the worksheet and figure out the range of the data that's in the worksheet. So if we switch back to Excel, if we go to the first sheet, we don't want to convert the entire worksheet, including all of these blank cells, to JSON. We don't want a bunch of empty strings in there. So we only want to convert the range A1 to C16. And instead of having to provide this range manually to our data parser, we want to have it figure out the number of columns and the number of rows to parse automatically. And that's what we're writing right now in our code. We want to receive the sheet name as a string as one of our parameters, and this function is going to return a range. Now let's declare our variables that we're going to use to keep track of what rows and columns we are currently in the loops that we're about to write in this function. We're going to assign this variable a value of 0. Assign this one a value of 1. And this one a value of 100. So we are going to be looping through each cell in this function, and we want to keep track of how many rows we've counted so far that we know have data in them. And this is of course going to be set to 0 at first, because as far as we know, there's no data until we've counted it. We're going to use row counter to keep up with what row we're currently on in our loop, and rows to count is how many rows we should count at first. So if we copy these 3 variable declarations, paste them again, and now we're going to change the word row to column. And we're going to change the value for columns to count to 50, because there's most likely going to be more rows than there are columns in any given data set. So we're going to only initially check the first 100 rows and the first 50 columns. So now let's write our first do while loop. And inside this, we're going to have a nested loop. And in here, we're going to have an if statement, if worksheets, and then we're going to pass it the sheet name that we were given, dot cells. We're going to pass the current row that we're on and the current column that we're on. If this cell, if its value is not equal to an empty string, which means that it has data in it, then we're going to want to do some stuff with this cell. We're going to record this cell as one of our used rows, so we want to include it. And then we are going to check to see if the column counter is greater than columns or used columns. And if it is, then we're going to set used columns equal to column counter. And then we're going to check to see if used rows equals rows to count. Then we're going to increase rows to count, because this is limiting how many we're going to loop through. If the 100th row has data, then we're going to want to keep checking more rows. We're not going to want to stop at the 100th row. So we're going to add 100 to the rows to count variable. So it equals to itself plus 100. And then we're going to do a similar thing here with columns. If used columns equals columns to count, then we're going to increase columns to count by 50. Then outside of this initial if statement here, after it ends, we're going to increment column counter. This way we can check the next column. And then after this first loop, but before the second loop closes here, we want to increment the row counter. And we want to reset the column counter, because we always want to check the first column whenever we are checking a new row. And after the outside loop here, we're going to return the range that we found that has data. So we're going to set our function equal to worksheets sheet dot range worksheets sheet. And of course, we're getting the range here, so our first cell in the range is going to be the first cell, A1. And then we're going to be getting the address of the last cell that we found. And that's it for this function. Now we need to write our second function here, which is called toJSON. And we want the first parameter to be called range to parse, and it is a range. And the second parameter is going to be parse as arrays, and this is going to tell us whatever's calling this function if they want us to return a JSON string with the data as an array of arrays or not. And of course this is going to be returning a string. Let's declare our variables. And we're going to be looping through our range that we're given as an argument. So we need some variables to help us keep track of where we are in our loops. And we want to set parsed data equal to an open bracket. And finally, we're going to declare a string called temp. Now we're going to check the value of our parse as arrays parameter, the argument that we're passed. We're going to see if it's true, then we're going to do some stuff, and if it's false, we're going to do some other stuff. So if it's true, then we know we need to return an array of arrays. So we're going to have a for loop for row counter equals 1 to range to parse dot rows dot count. We're first going to reset our temp value to an empty string. And inside this for loop, we're going to have another for loop for column counter equals 1 to range to parse dot columns dot count. And inside this loop, we're going to set temp equal to itself, and we're going to concatenate double quotation mark. In Visual Basic, if you have two quotation marks inside of two other quotation marks, that equals one quotation mark. So we're going to then add a range to parse dot cells row counter column counter. So that's where we're actually adding the cells value, and then we're going to add another quotation mark and comma. And then we're going to set temp equal to open bracket, and then we want to add itself minus the last character, because we have an extra comma in the temp variable that we don't need. We want to remove the last character, and in order to do this, we're going to use the left function, pass it the string, and then for the length of the string to grab, we're going to use the length of the string minus 1, and then we're going to concatenate a closing bracket, and then we're going to set parsed data to itself with temp tacked on to the end. So now we are done with this first part of the if statement. If we need to return an array of JSON objects, we're going to run the code that we're about to write, which has a for loop for row counter equals 2 to range to parse dot rows dot count. The reason why we're setting this equal to 2 instead of 1 like we did up here is because if we are creating an array of JSON objects, then we don't want to include the column header, which is going to be the first row. So we're starting with the second row because that's where our data actually starts. So first thing we're going to do in this loop is we're going to set temp variable equal to an empty string, and then we're going to have another loop. Have column counter equal 1 because the first column has actual data in it, to range to parse dot columns dot count. And inside of this nested loop, we're going to set temp equal to itself and a quotation mark and range to parse dot cells, and then we're going to reference the first row because that's where our header is, and then the column counter so we can get the proper key for our property that we are placing into this JSON object, and then another quotation mark and a colon and another quotation mark and range to parse. Now we're actually placing in the properties value here. Dot cells, row counter, column counter, and another quotation mark, and finally a comma. And that's it for this loop. After this loop finishes, we're going to set temp equal to a curly bracket and itself except for the last character. Then we're going to tack on the closing curly bracket and a comma, and then we're going to set parsed data equal to itself and temp. And now we need to write the code that runs after our initial if statement. We're going to set parsed data equal to itself except for the last character, which is an extra comma. And then we're going to tap on the closing bracket. And then we're going to return parsed data. So now we've written all the code that we need. We're going to hit Control A and copy our code, go back to Excel, and we are going to switch to Sheet 2 and go over to the Developer tab here in the ribbon and choose Visual Basic. Right click in this side pane, choose Insert Module, and then you're just going to paste the code, close this window. We're going to right click on our button and choose Assign Macro, and now we're going to choose the macro that we created called Parse Data, and then choose OK and click Parse. And now you can see we have a JSON string of our data with an array of objects with each property with the proper key and proper value. And now we can test to see if we got the other part right, where we just want an array of arrays. So we're going to get rid of the first row, which is our header. We're going to go back to Visual Basic, change this argument to true so that it knows we want an array of arrays, and we're going to hit parse again. And now you can just see that we don't have the property keys anymore. We just have just plain strings, and it all reflects the data in our first sheet. Thank you for watching. I hope it's been helpful. And remember, you can get all of the code to do whatever you want with from GitHub via the download link in the description. Thanks.